When I was considering a run for mayor of Bloomington, the first person I went to for advice was Dr. Noel. And for your advice, I am definitely grateful. So it is with great pleasure that I can introduce to you today Dr. Terry Noel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Today we're going to talk about a topic that some of you may be interested in, and some of you may wonder why we're even talking about Bitcoin at a libertarian convention. Now, the fascinating thing about the Bitcoin story is we have seen a development in literally the last 5 years which has solved one great problem of currency and money supply and what money is based on that up until that time was really an intractable problem. I'm not going to talk to you at great length about the technology behind Bitcoin because I don't understand it. I understand enough to ask some good questions and hopefully give you a few things to think about when you look at Bitcoin. And I think it has direct relevance for what we're trying to accomplish with the limited government movement, including the Libertarian Party. So let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about why we need money at all. And let's imagine, for the sake of our own edification, a small group of people, let's call them a tribe. Let's say maybe it's less than 100 people. And these people don't have contact with anybody else on the planet. In fact, they don't even know there's anybody else on the planet, and there doesn't have to be for purposes of our example. But these people are basically living in a pre-technological society, except they do have a few rudimentary tools at their disposal, and they have some sharps so they can figure out a few things. And two of them happen to be talking one morning. One's name is Ugg, and one's name is Og. And one says to Ugg, "You look like crap. What's wrong?" And Ugg says, "I didn't get a wink of sleep last night." So what's wrong? "Oh, that blanket I made myself fell apart in the middle of the night, almost froze to death." Ugg says to Og, "By the way, you're looking a little bit lean. Is something wrong?" "Every time I hunt, the arrows go flying off in all directions. They never go straight. I haven't eaten in days." And mutually, an idea arises among Ugg and Og. And Ugg says, "Well, my blankets are for shucks, but I make a pretty good bow and arrow." Og, on the other hand, makes these wonderful blankets that last for years. And so they decide to strike a bargain. In the future, one will make all the bows and arrows, and one will make the blankets. So among these two people, something wonderful has happened in human civilization. We see that people realize that specialization makes a difference. Nobody can do all things well. Imagine, if you would, for a moment, if from the time you awoke in the morning until the time that you went to bed at night, you were responsible for every facet of your survival. How many of your hours would be taken up with just staying alive, staying warm, staying fed? And pretty soon you come to the conclusion that all of them would be taken up in mere survival. And if you were lucky, you might survive. Now, with this specialization in trade, something really, really neat happened. We had the establishment of the barter system. And most of you are familiar with the concept of bartering. I have something, you have something, we trade. Now, something that at least 535 people in this country do not understand is that in a barter trade, both parties are better off. The pie has gotten bigger. We haven't given people smaller pieces. We've made the entire pie bigger. The wealth of Og and Ugg collectively went up. Now, once this is established, lots and lots of other things can happen. Now other pairs of people start realizing, hey, you do this better, I do that better. And so pretty soon we see our little society here start to grow in wealth. Now it grows in wealth not because there's any money, but because the things that can be used in day-to-day existence can be made more cheaply and with less time involvement on parts of the inhabitants of our little tribe. This barter system works very well, in fact, could continue indefinitely. But there are a few hitches with the barter system. One is, I may need something, and you may want something that I have, but those two wants don't happen to coincide. In fact, there's a fancy name originated by the economist Jevons. It's called it a double coincidence of wants. You'll usually see it these days as just a coincidence of wants. If we happen to need mutually beneficial things at the same time, we trade. There's no need for a medium of exchange. Well, now let's say that this tribe starts to develop some complexity, which can happen even in groups of less than 100 people. And people start realizing that this coincidence of wants is a limitation. Well, now let's also say that they happen to have this little thing that's not really worth anything in terms of its utility. It's a shell, just a plain old shell. But it's the type of shell that is not very easy to find, and over the years has come to be kind of a collector's piece, and people have this thing which is readily identifiable as being a particular type of shell, and it's not in abundance. So the supply of it remains fairly constant. Now, nobody has to make a rule, but let's just say somebody gets the bright idea one day, well, if you give me a blanket and I don't have something to trade right now, but I have these shells, I can give you these shells. Now, these shells will be a marker that lets me know, lets us remember mutually that we've traded something, and then later when we need to trade in reverse, the shells go the other way and the goods like that. Now this has done something really wonderful. What it's done is it's given us the ability to store value. So somebody can make a lot of blankets, but they don't have to trade them right away. They can trade them as they need them, store the value if they don't need something, trade it later. A lot of advantages. So what are these shells called? Money. We just had money invented. Nobody had to do it. It arose spontaneously from the act of trade among thinking people. Once we had that basis, we had something that allowed human civilization to really skyrocket in terms of evolutionary time to a stage rapidly unmatched by anything we know of in the universe. Now we get to recent history and we realize that money then has taken some different forms. Now, for reasons that we won't go into, a couple of things in history have turned out to be pretty neat forms of money. They usually have turned out to be gold and silver. Now we're going to stick primarily to gold because it has very few industrial uses like silver does, and we don't confuse utility value with value in trade. But basically gold, because it had certain characteristics, was a favored commodity for trading among people, so it became money. Now, once gold became money, it was traded, although we don't have a good historical record, it was traded probably in just loose form or some type of powder or something that could be weighed. One great thing about gold is it can be weighed very easily, and its purity can be tested fairly easily as well. Now, somewhere around the 7th century BC, a long time ago, somebody figured out, well, rather than having to weigh the stuff and test its purity each time we do a trade, why don't we melt it, because gold has some other interesting properties. It's easy to mold into particular shapes. It's very durable. They made something called coins. Now let's keep in mind that a coin doesn't necessarily have to be minted by a public entity with authority. It can be minted by somebody privately. So these things were very easy to use now in trade, because you could pretty much look at that, see the insignia, and go, oh, okay, that's good. Now there's always the possibility of counterfeit, but it took us a step forward as a civilization and enabled us to trade much more freely. We see it as soon as the 3rd century BC in Mesopotamia, financial records evolving. So not only was there a nice form of money to use to trade, but we had records of these things, which is another big step forward, because you can do lots of neat things in a civilization if you can keep track of where money is going and for what reason. Now, later on, and we'll touch on this in just a moment, we had the evolution of a different kind of money. Kublai Khan in the 13th century AD decided that the Chinese empire at that time should be unified with a system of money. It had been kind of distributed, what you might call feudally, among different tribes or collections of people in the Chinese empire. And because he decreed it, this paper money was circulated. Marco Polo, when he visited China, was absolutely amazed that people could conduct trade by trading nothing but pieces of paper. Now, the gold standard was a link to what had been spontaneously valued by human beings, but was represented by paper. And up until a few decades ago, the paper bills that we carry were really markers for something that was accepted widely as a tangible store of value, namely gold. Now we have what is called fiat money. We'll get to that in just a minute. But basically, fiat money is because I say so money. Because I say so, this is money. And as long as we all believe that, we're fine. So don't go out of this room screwing it up, all right? That's money in your pocket there, all right? Yeah, says me. Now, what makes good money are a couple of things. It has to be a store of value. So in other words, good money is the type that we can put away when we don't need it and save it for when we do need it. Now, we all know there are some problems with that with fiat currencies, but basically if money doesn't have this characteristic, it ceases to function as money. If I give you something in trade that you know has a very high chance of being worthless within a few weeks or months or even years, it ceases to have the psychological and social characteristics that it needs to function well as money. It's a unit of accounting, so it's something that we can compare things. So how do I know whether 1 cow equals 4 goats or 5 goats? Yeah. Well, if you have a system of money, which we have set units, it's easy to say one is worth X number of units of whatever our money is, and the other is worth Y units. So we have a mathematical ratio that we can kind of see what things are valuable and how people value things, at least economically. It's a medium of exchange, which means that instead of bartering, it intermediates between the two things that we're bartering. So we don't exchange the goods themselves, we exchange this medium, which allows us to either spend that on something else now or wait until later. Now, here, this one's important. Okay, and we're going to get to this in a minute with BitCoin. It must be accepted by the public. There is no decree on the planet that can force people to accept a money that they don't actually believe in. And there have been cases in history where people have even risked the threat of execution because it would be suicide anyway for them to accept a particular type of money that had been hyperinflated. They knew they couldn't survive because once they were out of money, they couldn't buy food or shelter or anything else. Last, let's remember that wealth, the things we can eat cover ourselves with at night, fend off attackers, and all these tangible things is different from money. And we shouldn't conflate those two. Some people do, and because of that, they tend to think that injecting more money into an economy is a solution to having more wealth. And we see how that's playing out. Now, gold can be measured by weight, which makes it easier to check the authenticity of it, which we mentioned a moment ago. But an interesting thing arose as people in authority started to recognize that coining money made a lot of sense and had some advantages. And this is called seigniorage. Seigniorage is when an authority, and it doesn't, again, have to be a public mint. This can actually be a private mint in which this seigniorage is effectively a tax. But it is a decree that says a coin that is minted is more than the value of what's in it plus its manufacture or production cost. Let's think about that a minute. We got gold and powder in a certain form. The weight of it has come to be valued as 4 cows, all right? So this unit bag of gold that weighs the same is worth 4 cows. Now we take that and we say, we're going to take this now and each of these bags of gold, we're going to melt down and make a coin out of it. It's worth 4 cows. Seigniorage is a governmental authority saying we're going to mint these. People have to accept these as money. And by the way, that's worth 6 cows. Why? Because I said so, right? Now the difference there, that 2 extra cows, why might that be an advantage to a government? Well, it gives them more to spend, right? So seigniorage is kind of fudging on the spontaneously perceived value of a commodity like gold. Fiat money, which the entire planet is on right now, has removed all pretense of any link to any commodity like gold whatsoever. It is money by decree. Now, does it work? Well, yes, it works in the sense that we're all functioning fairly well in an economy. Will it work for the long run is highly doubtful, and that's another reason the emergence of BitCoin is such an important development. Bitcoin. Now, all that I've told you about money remains true of Bitcoin in the characteristics that Bitcoin has to satisfy in order to function as good money. This was just 2009. 2009. Just 5 years ago, a white paper was written, and it emerged from where we would never expect. An economist did not come up with this. It was a cryptographer. Now, cryptography, as you may recall, is what people do when they don't want others to know what they're communicating to other people. And the mathematics now and the computers that enable all kinds of encoding has gotten to the point where I've envisioned this as a fairly esoteric, very small group of people that talk to each other all over the planet about these weird ways of encrypting messages. And this person, or we think it's a person named Satoshi Nakamoto, we still don't know who that is. And we don't even know if it's a person. It could be a group of people. We're just not sure. The last known correspondence from him was in 2011 when he is alleged to have said, I've moved on to other things. Well, if this is the success that I hope it will be, I hope he does something like cures cancer or something. Because that's what he's done essentially. Now this white paper did something interesting. It solved a problem that had not before that been solved in terms of peer-to-peer exchanges. Now peer-to-peer exchanges work like this. If we have gold and gold coins, it's easy to keep track of. You have 5 gold coins, you have 7 gold coins, and you have so many goats, and you have so many pigs, and you have so many blankets, and so forth. And we have those. Okay. No doubt, right? It's there. Now, when we get to more sophisticated forms of money, then it becomes a little more complicated. Even something as simple as a checking account is a record. So on a ledger somewhere, there are these transactions recorded. Now, with a checking account, what's to keep us if we have this money that we don't actually send in the form of green pieces of paper that represent gold or the gold itself? It is a recorded transaction. It is information. Keep that thought in your head, because that's what Bitcoin is all about. What is to keep us from writing checks for funds twice, or 3 times or 4 times? Nothing, except it is cleared through a central authority. In our case, it's the Federal Reserve. Every check you write gets cleared through the Federal Reserve System. Now, this all happens in an instant these days, but here's the gist of it. Now we know that once you spent that $25 for a bushel of jawbreakers, then you can't go spend that same $25 on something else, something useless. So, how do you solve this problem if you don't have a central authority? Well, what Nakamoto proposed was a completely digital form of money which takes out the material at all. So the information, unlike a ledger, doesn't represent money. It is money. Zeros and ones. And Lord knows we'll never run out of those. Right? Always be zeros and ones. That is the money. And the reason it is money is he set up a system in which it was impossible or near impossible to double spend, because all of the transactions in Bitcoin are cleared every 10 minutes. And the way it's done is not through one central server with an authority, but he figured out a way to get peer-to-peer networks. So he provided an incentive for people to get software that would help verify all of the transactions on the planet every 10 minutes and update a block of information about all of the transactions that had occurred. Now, your name doesn't even have to be associated with this. This is a code, it's an address, and it's a god-awful looking thing, and if you ever lose it, you're SOL, right? Because there's no way to redo a transaction. It's like cash. You drop it and it floats down the sewer, it's gone, all right? So this mimics gold and other good forms of money in some very, very interesting ways. The way it works is they are mined by computers. Now, what that means is the original Bitcoin was seeded, and legend has it that the first purchase of a tangible good by Bitcoin was Papa John's Pizza. But Papa John's didn't accept Bitcoin at that time. They probably still don't, but they bought it through a third party, what meant somebody bought the pizza, but somebody paid those people that bought the pizza in Bitcoin. I thought that's pretty interesting. Now, once this system is set up, computer people, anybody, you can do this, anybody over the whole world can earn money by confirming the transactions that have just occurred in the last 10 minutes. So, in order for you to get credit, which you would be paid in Bitcoins, you have to be able to come up with a very complex code that kind of seals that, as if you're kind of the old emperor, you know, hot wax in the ring. And this seals this block of information. Here's the trick, though. It takes an enormous amount of computing power to beat out everybody else that's trying to come up with the same thing. In fact, don't even try it with a regular PC. It takes either huge computing power, and even if you did have a CPU that was pretty powerful and you used the graphics card, the amount of money you would spend in electricity would outweigh the amount you could earn in Bitcoins. That's how complicated it is. Why is that so good? All right, how does the supply of gold increase?
Dig it up.
You got to dig it up. It takes some effort, doesn't it? You know, there's enough gold in the ocean that would blow gold right out of the water as a good form of money,
Making it too common.
making it way too common. The problem is there's so little gold in seawater that getting it out costs way too much. So for right now, excuse me, gold is still a good form of money because it doesn't increase a lot. You can go out and get rich by finding gold. You don't have to create something of value to other people. You can go get the money itself. The problem is it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money to do that. So when you do that, how do you control a digital currency like that? Well, this is what the mining does. Now, not only that, but the mining gets harder to do the further time goes along. So it gets twice as hard. Next, I think it's 2017 that the restrictions kick in to make it harder to mine, and then harder and harder. And last, excuse me, there is an arbitrary limit of 21 million Bitcoins. Once that many Bitcoins are in circulation, the creation of Bitcoin stops. Now that means that we've got a handy method for preventing this kind of money from inflating to the point where we have way too much in supply chain and way too few goods and services. Okay? So one of the things that's a problem with fiat money, which it can be created willy-nilly with no limit, is this has a definite limit set into it. Now there's no central authority, and this is all a peer-to-peer arrangement, which means that people are trading one with the other. I give you Bitcoins for a Papa John's pizza, and we're done. Nobody has blessed us and said you had to accept Bitcoin. That's legal tender laws saying you have to accept certain forms of money. Nobody said Bitcoin is a form of money. It just happened, and people agreed, yeah, I accept that because I believe that I can trade this later for something I value. It happened spontaneously, and governments hate it.
Oh, good.
Bloody hate it. Now, some of them are getting smart enough to realize that this is inevitable, so they're trying to find ways to screw it up by helping. And whether they succeed in the end remains to be seen. But there are some neat things that this does for us. One, it allows us more or less to remain anonymous in our transaction. Now, I don't want to be misleading. When you go to the chain block, which is this record every 10 minutes of all of the transactions that have transpired all over the globe with Bitcoin, if somebody wanted to take enough time, they could take a pretty good guess at who you were by matching up addresses. But when I read the process one would have to go through, I think, yeah, I'm anonymous. I mean, they really have to make an effort to discover who you were. It's used globally. Now, one argument here is this is going to help less developed countries because capitalizing projects and things like that, sometimes regularly accepted currencies, it's problematic, and the lending rules and so forth. So Bitcoin might help people in that particular situation. And it's very, very hard to track, which is another thing governments don't like. Because it can't be tracked, we have some issues with taxation. We have some issues with what are currently illegal activities, such as the drug trade. Interestingly, and something I kind of figured the government didn't even believe Bitcoin was real money, but once they found they could confiscate it, they believed it. And the Silk Road. Well, how many of you shop at Silk Road? What kind of illegal drugs do you buy? I have no knowledge of having ever raised my hand. No. the Silk Road, I have no idea what you can get there. I'm not interested, but from what I understand, you can get illegal drugs and so forth. The problem was because Bitcoin was used to do the transactions, it wasn't traceable, and the government didn't like this.
Bitcoin plus Tor, the onion router.
Plus what?
Tor, the onion router.
The onion?
Just anonymizing web
Oh, I see.
traffic.
Right.
So you had anonymous traffic and anonymous currency.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Silk Road process.
Yeah. And so, boy, they didn't like that at all. So we're going to speculate in just a minute about why that might be a good thing. All right. Now, there are some issues, of course, with Bitcoin. So before everybody runs out and puts all your savings into Bitcoin, when I first heard about Bitcoin, it was like 56 cents or something for a Bitcoin. I wish I'd have bought $100 worth, because right now I'd be sitting on about $500 million. I think that's what it amounts to. Price volatility. A new idea, the price of this thing's going to go up and down and up and down. I am not a believer in day-to-day trading or hour-to-hour trading or guessing the market. I'm much too much of a cynic. So be cautious before you experiment with Bitcoin, but price volatility is one issue, which would not matter so much except it's priced against, let's say, $1, what we usually trade in. So when you talk about what can I buy for $1, how many Bitcoins can I get for $1, and what is that going to buy me, varies so much day to day, it's very hard to do any kind of financial planning. Another one is we had a big exchange, Mt. Gox. I out-sophisticated myself. I kept pronouncing this until yesterday, Mount Goo. I guess that'd be G-E-A-U-X, Mount Goo. I thought Gox, I mean, that sounds like a Klingon dish or something. So, but it is Mt. Gox, I found out. And it turns out that they had built the biggest exchange for Bitcoin in the world, but they hadn't been very careful about how they managed it. And the entrepreneur in charge of that let some things slide, and there were some issues with hacking, and they lost track of some Bitcoins. Now let's remember, a Bitcoin is only information and only exists because that information is out there somewhere on a peer-to-peer network of computers. Now there are a lot of them, so it's not like one server getting hit and the information is gone. There's lots of redundancy, but still, the only way you can retrieve your money is by having that address or that particular code that lets the system know, yes, you own those things. Otherwise, you go to spend it, you got nothing. It's kind of like somebody went into a bank, pulled all the money in your account out. You can't have it to spend. Most of the coinage was never recovered. It's about $473 million worth at the time that the bust happened of Bitcoin. That's 7% of the Bitcoins that were in circulation.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. That was a big hit. In fact, Mt. Gox really got people to kind of do this. Now, surprisingly, at least surprisingly to me, this didn't bring the whole Bitcoin system down. There have been only about 2 glitches. One, early in the history of Bitcoin, there was a glitch that allowed an unlimited number of Bitcoins to be manufactured, which for obvious inflationary reasons was not a good thing. And in one brief period, they had a double chain because of a software glitch in which we had 2 and not just 1 record of transactions. But wisely, they shut the whole system down, advised Bitcoin people to go to the former version of Bitcoin software, reintegrated the tracks, and then from then on there hadn't been any problems. This is unbelievable to me. Yeah?
I'm stuck on the fact that I thought an earlier PowerPoint thing said that there were 23 million Bitcoins.
No, that's capped at 21 million. Not dollars worth, that's coins. So
what's that 473 million?
that's the number of dollars equivalent of the number of Bitcoins valued at the time that Mt. Gox discovered its problems. So you've got 2 currencies, like if I'm talking about a Deutschmark and a dollar, okay? These can vary in their relative value. So the amount that it takes to trade evenly with one other, it's the same thing with a Bitcoin. Yeah, I can see how that'd be confusing. So this is dollars worth that were lost.
Okay.
Yeah.
How is that value set though? The value of a Bitcoin to fiat money?
It's a commodity like any other. What's that?
I'll give you $1 for Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's just the trade.
So it's
It's
strictly-
market set. In terms of its relationship to other currencies.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind.
Yeah.
So what happens to these addresses that are lost? Is that just
Gone
decrease the
forever.
total number of Bitcoins? Will there really effectively only be 20 million or 19 million or what?
When what now? You lost me on that last part.
When we expand the full amount of it mined out, we have to then subtract off the number that have been lost because nobody knows how to access them?
In other words, will those be counted toward the 21 million limit? I don't know that that's been addressed. I would think that they would make some adjustment one way or the other. My guess is that as far as the problem with inflation, it wouldn't be a significant issue because it would be the difference between 20 million, 21 million.
Yes,
How would
okay.
they know that the numbers
Coins-
are lost?
Coins are not lost. Access to the coins
Right,
are
how would
lost.
they know that?
They don't.
So,
To make an example, if you deposit money in a bank, and then you lose your ATM card and your checkbook, that money just sits in the bank, assuming there's no fees
State
associated with it.
gets it, state
And it
gets
just assuming that the state doesn't come and round up from this, the unfunded money or whatever, it just sits in the bank and no one can spend it, right? So this happens with Bitcoins. They are still in the blockchain. Account number 73 has 5 Bitcoins, but account number 73 is never accessed ever again because I forgot that I had account number 73.
so over
those
time,
coins are
the
still
maximum
there.
is gonna actually decrease.
Yes. The effective maximum will decrease, yes.
And let me tell you, this researching for this talk today, it's mind-boggling. The basic concept is really fascinating, but how clever Nakamoto was to come up with this system that works as well as it does is absolutely mind-boggling. So I too will sit like, no, wait a minute, I understand how mysterious money is, but it can't be this mysterious. The fact that zeros and ones can be used in this fashion as money at all is a significant leap forward. Now, like the internet, it took us 20 years to figure out what the internet was truly useful for, and we still don't know. I mean, Twitter, come on. So this is a significant step forward, and being only 5 years old, I'm shocked that we haven't had more major catastrophes than we have. What are some of the other problems with Bitcoin? Well, one thing, I always think of the worst possible scenario. I was a farmer. You always think of the worst thing that can happen, right? It's not going to rain, it's going to rain too much. The barn's going to blow down, the cows are going to die.
Water in.
Yeah, my father used to say, they used to raise sheep when he was a kid. He said, I'm so glad we quit raising sheep. He says, because a sheep is just an animal looking for a way to die. So I said, yeah, okay, what can happen here? Well, one thing, price volatility, we covered up already. It's not universally accepted, which means that if I go and I want to purchase something, the chances of them accepting Bitcoin is fairly slim. The biggest acceptor of Bitcoins that I could find is WordPress. Now you go, WordPress. Until you realize how many big companies use WordPress as the backbone of their web system and their information system on the computer. That is a very, very, very big deal. Another problem is that the internet could fall into government hands. It is the only thing that has worked since I've been born is the internet. Only thing new that has really been radical and new and works. And now, for reasons I cannot even fathom, our president is trying to give away the control of ICANN to a governmental body the world over, which leads to one thing, government controlling the internet. Now, unless there is a shadow internet that is inaccessible by governments, which I suspect is out there somewhere, it's just they haven't told me about it, then what we have is a problem of the government coming in and just wiping out the whole system because they get control of the internet. No internet, no Bitcoin, no nothing when it comes to cryptocurrencies like this. And one thing that you don't hear a lot about, but is an increasing concern on the part of people that are worried about national defense, is an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. If someone were somehow able to lob a nuclear weapon. Now, we get electromagnetic pulses through natural occurrences too. If you've ever had a hard drive fried or a TV fried by lightning. Yeah, exactly. That's an electromagnetic pulse. But the, what's it? Solar flares, another example, exactly. Now, if somebody happens to lob a nuclear device into a high altitude position, there is an altitude that makes it maximally optimal, and a burst that would harm absolutely no one on the ground and wouldn't make us all mutate into horrible dragons and lizards would wipe out everything that you're carrying right now that has anything to do with electronics, unless you happen to be inside a lead safe at the time.
Or on vacuum tubes.
Or on vacuum tubes. Yeah, on vacuum tubes, exactly. So an electromagnetic pulse would instantly make all your smartphones, all your computers, everything go dead. And you might think, oh, dear me, I couldn't text for a few days. No, that's not the problem. The problem is that all of your medical devices, all the information that gets transferred, all our money and all this, so deeply dependent on that kind of information. An electromagnetic pulse would wreak absolute havoc. And once that got wiped out, it's not entirely clear, although Bitcoin does have a lot of redundancy, it's not entirely clear how or how fast we could recover from that.
Wait, what's an MEMP and an HE?
Nuclear electromagnetic impulse, and an H, it designates a high altitude. There are two different kinds. If somebody set off a nuclear device above us, it'd be bad. And it would probably have other effects besides the pulse. But there is one particular type, and don't ask me for the science behind this, but it harnesses part of the Earth's natural magnetic energy around the Earth. And when it goes off, it really wreaks havoc because it amplifies the effect of that pulse.
I think it's called the Compton effect.
Yeah, yeah. That's about as deep as I got into it, yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I happen to be a sign painter. So if I letter somebody's windows and they pay me in Bitcoin,
Mm-hmm.
who can I spend the Bitcoin with?
Anybody that accepts it.
And apparently not too many accept it.
Yes, surprisingly, it's getting to be more and more people.
And
You can use an exchange to turn it back into Federal Reserve notes if you want.
Yeah.
What's that?
The exchanges, go ahead.
The exchanges like Mt. Gox are ways to buy and sell Bitcoin for other currencies. So you can actually, there's a company now making Bitcoin ATMs as well.
Yep.
So you can go and turn money into Bitcoin if you want to do business with perhaps someone anonymously on the internet. And if someone pays you in Bitcoin and you don't have use for it, you can then sell that Bitcoin for cash, for US dollars, for euros, for yen, whatever.
how do you know how much you can get for a Bitcoin?
You can check the exchanges, just like you know how much can you get for a euro. When you come back from your vacation, you look at what the exchange rate is. There's published exchange rates for Bitcoin. You can buy it for this, you can sell it for that.
In fact, if, as far as your use, you would, unless you knew the logic behind it, Bitcoin would be no different than any other currency if it were widely accepted like the franc or the Deutschmark or the euro. You would just go, just like you buy something with a card or using your smartphone now,
Yeah.
you would just use that as a form of currency.
And for reporting reasons, political candidates who accept Bitcoin, typically you immediately convert it to cash because for government reporting, if I donate 1 Bitcoin to your campaign, you immediately turn it into $173 and then report a $173 contribution from me.
Yeah.
We're all,
Yeah.
$479.
eBay recently announced plans to accept it through PayPal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they're getting more and more. It's really, I mean, this is all shocking to me. I mean, if in 2009 you had said a cryptographer came up with something to do a whole entire system of currency that would rival other world currencies even a little bit, and there's nothing to it except information, I would have gone, what have you been smoking?
How much, that's it?
That's it.
It's just a free downloadable program that says,
Yep. Now, before you do that,
well, I have no intention of it, I wanted to.
no, I know, but this is a general caution.
The caveat.
You have to store these addresses, and there are what are called wallets, electronic wallets. If you lose the information in those, it's gone forever. So there are some precautions that people need to take about how to back up their information in a non-networked location, like a microdrive or something like that. Also, there are some online services for managing your Bitcoins. Usual precautions should be in place there. You know, this is new, volatile. If it were me, and I haven't done this yet, because I don't have any money, but if I had some money and I wanted to get some, I would just put a small amount and treat it like pocket cash and play with it, you know, see how I liked it and see what happened. Okay? So, here are some questions that I'd like to leave you thinking about. One, will cryptocurrency prevail, if not Bitcoin, some similar idea? And several have emerged. As far as I could tell from my research, they're all based on basically the same mining principle, the same basic logic that Bitcoin was founded on. The second thing is, what'll change? This really raises some interesting questions. If everybody's using Bitcoin, then taxation becomes a whole different thing, if it's even possible. Anonymity and exchange with other people, there's all kinds of very, very interesting issues of privacy that come up. What happens when enough people go to cryptocurrency? Well, we don't know that. And here's one that bugs me, and I'd like to leave you with this thought. Tyrants spend a lot of energy figuring out ways to get control over other people. You can bet some SOB right now is looking at cryptocurrency and trying to figure out if there is a way to gain control of that type of currency so they'll have the same type of control as they would over traditional forms of money. Now, that doesn't mean we can't overcome those kinds of issues, but it does mean we should probably be wary of those. Thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate you. Oh, it goes to you guys. You guys know more than I do about this. Thank you.